This is Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network. Welcome back again to Hello Brain. My name is Colin Adams. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by Dr. Ramona von Lieden and Dr. Dan O'Brien, and we're going to be continuing our conversation on ADHD. This will be part 2. So in the last episode, we talked specifically about the lived experience of ADHD. I shared some of the things that I do now versus what I did earlier in childhood. We talked about interest-based attention, emotional regulation, and then a lot about how movement can stimulate regulation. But understanding the brain better via our last conversation naturally leads to the next question: what now? What actually helps? And so I want to delicately start this conversation coming up because medication, especially in the ADHD world, is a very hot button issue. And there are a lot of strong opinions for, strong opinions against, a lot of people who just don't know who to trust or what opinion to take. And so as we kind of start this medication conversation, I want to ask the question, and Dr. Dan, I'll pose it to you first. How can people think about the role of medication in supporting the ADHD brain?
Yeah, no, great question, Colin. I think when I look at medication and treatment, it's all about managing symptoms, right? I don't think we use medical therapy to be able to cure, but a lot of it is certainly managing. What's interesting, a quick story is, through medical school, I went to school with a lot of students that actually had ADHD and that took Adderall just to try to increase that focus. And just some of the side effects that I noticed I thought were kind of a bit odd. And I think it's, to your point earlier in the last episode, getting the right dosing, the right medication to be able to optimize treatment. But certainly, I think as we look at it, there's different therapies, there's different modalities. They all come with certain side effects. And I think we have to look at how do we manage symptoms? Because ultimately that I think is the role of medical therapies, is how do we manage? And I think that's a really key component. And I think that when we look to the future of medicine, I think there's certainly, as this is getting looked at, it's being studied a lot more. There's going to be more, I think, more different therapies, more modalities to be able to help these patients get better and really treat symptoms. So I'm really looking forward to the future of what this holds. When we look at neuroscience, when we look at brain health, that's what we're doing this, right? There's just so much right now within brain health to be able to help not only patients, other individuals, so many people in the population. And it's an exciting time for brain health for us to kind of come together as a community and really help each other.
Yeah, I love that you brought up using it as like a way to manage symptoms, not a cure. And I think one thing that I experienced personally and can be really helpful is to think of it like a support or like a partner, because in the ADHD brain, naturally, there are just things that don't work the way that they should, or maybe they work a little slower or a little too fast or just differently. And to have something just kind of walk alongside you for a period of time while that person develops the skills, develops the systems, learns more about their brain and what it needs and how it interacts with different environments and tasks, it can be a really helpful thing to support that process.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Colin. I think medication in general, right, as you've acknowledged, the ADHD involves sort of dysregulation in 2 major neurotransmitter systems that we discussed in part 1 of this series: dopamine for motivation and reward, and then norepinephrine for alertness and focus. Both of those systems regulate activity in the prefrontal cortex. To kind of remind the group about that's the area that controls attention, your working memory, your emotional regulation, impulse control. So most of the ADHD medications simply increase the availability of dopamine and norepinephrine to these circuits, right? Now, as you mentioned, the side effects were something that you experienced when you were first on medication, and I think that makes sense, since probably the most commonly known and probably commonly prescribed are the stimulants, which I'd ask about sort of your experience with that, but in general, stimulants like Ritalin or Adderall block dopamine and norepinephrine, allowing those signals to stay longer or active longer in the synapse, so that you have that ability to hold on to attention But on the flip side, if you have a stimulant, I imagine that can also, for an ADHD brain that has the additional um, emotional component to it, that can feel quite jarring if your levels are not what they need to be. So I think that's something I'd love to hear from you as we discuss medication options. Like getting that right amount is so crucial. It is really a titration and not just a, hey, we're going to use it and you're going to feel better.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a give and go process of learning what works best, and also being able to have like a support system to where you can talk about some of the symptom or like the side effects that you're experiencing, and then be able to then, yeah. And so some of the side effects that I was experiencing were very much related to the stimulant nature of the medication. I think that I noticed things like having a hard time falling asleep for sure, but internally just feeling like everything got a bit bigger than it already was. And like we talked about in the last conversation, emotions can already feel big inside of the ADHD brain and system. So that kind of made it feel a bit bigger, and I had to learn systems for how to better manage my emotions in general, but also to be able to work with that medication for the time that I was on it.
Is the fact that, what I've seen a lot of the great physicians do is use side effects to their benefit, right? Having that ability to, as these side effects occur, making sure that they can use that to maybe benefit the patient. So I think that's something to kind of think about, right? With therapies that not a lot of physicians know about. So it's just understanding, again, through pharmacology, you're learning the MOA, you're certainly learning the side effects, but how can those side effects really maybe benefit the patient? Being able to utilize that is I've always thought is very fascinating.
Yeah, one question I wanted to ask you guys was, it seems to me from the outside looking in that parents fear going into the doctor to talk about ADHD with their child, maybe because they're fearful that they're automatically going to get prescribed a medication, and maybe that's not where they want to start. It might be a helpful tool that they consider, but maybe it's not where they want to start. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that, and maybe what the current process is in the medical field around how are we approaching ADHD when someone comes in and says, hey, I'm experiencing these symptoms and I'd like to address them.
Yeah, that's really, I think, an interesting question, Colin. I think first of all, it starts with maybe some parent denial, right? Understanding the schooling system, some of the resources that are out there. And I think that's where I think clinicians, school systems, parents have to work together to be able to understand what resources can really help these kids. And I think, I think parents start off with a little bit of denial that they feel like their child doesn't have ADHD. And I think it's through, again, evaluations and certain questions and activities that you're able to kind of pick up on that. But again, I think it's creating, to your point earlier, a creative environment for that student to be successful.
So ADHD brains respond extremely well to external opportunities to kind of interact. So I think that external supports can really stabilize the system. So there's a couple different tools. One which we very briefly touched on in the last segment on neurofeedback would be the first one if you wanted to start with something that wasn't medication. Neurofeedback basically trains the brain to regulate its own activity. Colin's experience with that, I think, is very telling. That ability to see the activity that your brain is happening can sometimes be the external cue and external stimulus that you need to make a change. So for those who aren't familiar with neurofeedback, I'd love to kind of share what really it is. So neurofeedback sensors measure brainwave patterns and then give real-time feedback so the brain learns to shift towards the more optimal states. So protocols that are focused on an ADHD brain are going to aim to increase beta activity, which is more associated with focus, and decrease theta activity, which is like your drowsiness and inattentive states. Honestly, in the research studies, the results are pretty mixed. But I think with ADHD, like many of these conditions that we may discuss on this podcast, individualized care might really show you something different. And so obviously with your experience, that's a good one. Similarly, other external ones, it's as simple as looking at things like breath work. We've discussed breath work a few times on the podcast already, but since breathing rhythms influence the autonomic nervous system, So if you practice slow breath work or breath patterns, you can activate your parasympathetic system, which calms your emotional reactions and improves your prefrontal regulation. So for ADHD patients, working on breath work can improve impulse control. It can improve emotional stability. It can create attentional persistence. And especially when in ADHD, you have a nervous system that can be a bit more reactive. Breathing can be an extremely helpful biological regulation tool.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in really quick there to talk about breath work. I actually, before we recorded today, did something called conscious connected breathing for about 20 minutes before we jumped on, just to kind of get my nervous system into a centered place where I'd be ready for this kind of a conversation. And the way I like to talk about how breath work helps the ADHD brain specifically is this is something I did as a health coach a lot. And the ADHD brain is often flooded by emotions. And so if you can think about it, it's like you're up on this screen, and you're in the screen, and everything that's in the screen is around you. Like, you got all the things you got to do that day. You've got all of your emotions and feelings and thoughts are just swarming around your head at all times. What breath work has the opportunity to do is bring the nervous system back to a state where the stress response and the rest response are working together, kind of like a teeter totter at a children's playground, if you can remember those, and takes you as the person off of the screen and out of the chaos and into the theater, if you will, like where you're able to look up at the screen and then point at the different things that you want to pay attention to. Like, maybe I know that, like, through the breath work, I recognize that one of my biggest triggers right now is just feeling upset. And so I'm going to specifically address that instead of feeling flooded, like you need to address all of it all at once.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think, Colin, to have that down regulation, both of you guys through breath, through meditation. Now we're seeing actually in medical schools is they're creating little rooms where students would kind of go in after class or maybe in between classes and have that calmness, that sense of meditation. I find that very interesting, right? Medical school can be very stressful, very intense. And having those separate rooms to calm that down regulate nervous system is, I think, could be the future maybe of the schooling system, not only medical schools, graduate schools, but grade schools and high schools, to almost have that I call reset room where the child can, or the teenager can go in there and just calm down, take a break, reset, down regulate.
I'll speak to that. There's a I'm going to give a little nod to a company that I know that does something in this space. Because the challenge, of course, if you have something in that system, and I think you're speaking to this, Dan, is the idea of having a space where someone can go and do that practice of having that moment to get away, to kind of down regulate from an external the external overstimulation. So there's a company here, and they're not the only ones out there, but they do VR meditation applications. A friend of mine runs it's called Higher Prana, and they are piloting in schools with this exact idea, this idea of saying, hey, if we can give students a way to step away from the chaos for a moment. And the nice thing with a virtual reality system is because it's headphones and it's the visual system is taken up, that they can do it anywhere. They could be just sitting in the middle of the classroom and you throw this on and it gives you that pause, that step away. Because that I think is the biggest challenge, is the reality is we don't always have the environment available to us to take that pause, especially with the way our education systems are organized, especially with overcrowding in schools, right? That's just so challenging. And I think in a med school environment, it's a little different. You've got a bit more space to kind of spread out, step away. They can kind of make that conscious decision. But I think for kids, this is a bigger challenge.
Do we think that would be the future, having a brain health room, so to speak? Would we
God, I hope so. I would love that. I know Colin would love that.
I would
On the
love
same,
that.
yeah, and I mean, I'll give another nod to another company that I'm near and dear to my heart because I am a scientific advisor for them. But photobiomodulation is another one, or red light therapy, or near infrared light. So Neuronic, which I work with, makes a brain health helmet. Literally, it uses near infrared light to increase mitochondrial activity in neurons, and that there is research on this in the attention and ADHD area that shows that it could support cognitive performance, mental fatigue, executive function. And again, it's you're using these tools not to fix anything, but to support increasing availability of energy and blood flow, and increasing your ATP production, increasing the cerebral activity, so that someone who has ADHD has that ability to focus, and they just have a bit more resources within their own body.
I love that. Yeah, that's what it's all about, is creating the resources, because we talked earlier about how medication isn't meant to be seen as a cure. And even neurofeedback really helps me even to this day. And it's a great experience. I love doing neurofeedback. But it's meant to be a tool that helps me to better manage and understand my brain and learn what it needs. And I didn't really start to grow in this process until I became much more aware of how unique my brain was compared with other brains, its ability to change. And it took a lot of work and many frustrating days to better understand what my brain needed and how to recognize it in the moment. So, as we continue to talk about ADHD, how can understanding the ADHD brain through the conversation we're having and then other resources that are out there help someone grow like I've experienced over the last several years, instead of feeling like they need to suppress that aspect of themselves?
I'd love to start on this one. I think historically ADHD messaging is fix the brain, right? Fix what's wrong. You have ADHD, you can't focus, fix what's wrong. I think as we learn more and more about the brain, we realize that that's really not the situation. It's just a variation on neurotypical. So ADHD brains have different strengths in addition to those challenges. And I think for someone who's dealing with ADHD, having the ability to see those positives and see those strengths becomes a real win. So again, we spoke about this briefly last segment, but ADHD brains tend to be highly creative. They're novelty seeking. They are really good at rapid idea generation, so spitballing ideas, and that's a really helpful tool for in work, especially. They're also good at recognizing patterns, and can, when needed, have that intense focus. So I think if we understand that they can, as people understand their brain better, they learn how to build an environment that supports those skills that are really a positive. And then recognize when your regulation is slipping away, and then try to develop strategies to manage that rather than make it a shame or something is wrong with you.
Yeah, it's certainly a good point. I mean, there's certainly a stigma, right, that comes with ADHD. And I think it starts with the schooling system, creating that really creative environment instead of that traditional brick and mortar type of study. And I think as kids learn that at a young age, that creative environment within the school system, as they get into high school and college, there's other creative things schools can do. For example, I've seen high schools have kind of almost like a little pilot simulator, right? Where it's kind of like there's different activities that are preparing these kids for career choices rather than sitting down, taking a test 8 hours a day. Mm-hmm. So I think that having this start in the school system is really key, really optimal. And maybe we're going to see this shift, this transformation within the school system as more ADHD research comes out, and how schools can really help the child as well as the parents. So everyone's working together, right? We talk a lot in healthcare, having multidisciplinary teams coming together to be able to help patients. And I think the same thing with ADHD is having various teams come together to be able to help the child be very successful. And I think that's the future. And I think that's where we're headed.
I'd be curious, Colin, from your opinion, I think, as I mentioned in the last episode, creatives tend to, right, the gamification of a lot of things. We sometimes complain about gamification in technology, where everything's gamified, right? Even down to like online dating. I'll just put that out there, right? But on the flip side, I was just thinking about this as a kid. I remember like learning to type, right? One of these skills that like we all need to have. The gamification of that, which often includes patterning and pattern recognition, was crucial. Like, I don't think I would have ever learned to type without Mavis Beacon teaches typing. Like that, amazing. And it was like a very early, right, gamification. Whereas now we talk about Duolingo. I should start getting like a sponsorship from them because I talk about them so much. But similarly, learning a language has become so much more accessible for people because it is that same thing. I get that little hit of dopamine when I finish a section, and I want to finish the section and I get my triple XP points. But this is where we can, in the school system, like look at the positives of all these gamification applications and bring those into the environment, alternating between sort of your more traditional learning setups and also using what we've built in technology to help different brains learn faster.
Yeah, my sister actually was in the gifted and talented program as a kid, and then also taught it for several years where she's at. And I always thought it was so interesting how the structure of a day played out for a gifted and talented program versus a normal program. And they would come in and they'd get into groups and work together to solve some really complex issue or task. And it often dealt with movement, it dealt with building a physical thing. And my ADHD brain is like, wow, I would have done so well in that environment. I instead of going in and like your first subject is English and you're sitting there for 50 minutes learning about how to use a comma versus a colon and basically just dying in your chair of boredom. And an interesting story that actually came up was my sister was teaching second grade in a normal public school. And for the entire year, she had these two boys in her class who were just your classic ADHD, like very disruptive, very hyperactive, physical, would get up and walk around in the middle of the class. They would always blurt out things and talk, always causing problems. Over the summer, they got involved with a neurofeedback and heart rate variability and coherence training program, and just did this for the 3 months over the summer. And the same year, my sister actually stopped teaching at the public school and then moved to the gifted and talented program she was teaching in. And lo and behold, guess who was in her gifted and talented program that very next fall? It was those two boys, because all that had to happen was regulating a system that was dysregulated in development, and they were able to shine. And they weren't just like not disruptive, they were thriving in that environment. And so it's just really cool to see what a lot of these tools can do and how we can arrange systems like the school system to better support brains like this.
Oh my gosh, you just made me completely think about it. Same. I remember my gifted and talented program. We would do it like one day a week. We'd get pulled out to go to it. And it was always projects. It was never sitting down and learning in a traditional structure. It was always getting hands on. It was always exploring it on your own. It was always something that was way more task oriented. You're making me think about this in a new way, Colin.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Though.
I mean,
Because
it's
really the purpose is to be able to think, right? I mean, the purpose of education is the ability to think. So you're creating environments which are very creative. Kids are thinking through various projects. And I think that's the future of education, is how do we have these ideas to make sure the kids are actually thinking, not just memorizing and regurgitating. Having taught too at the college level, I always try to create tasks and opportunities where students were able to think, they're able to be creative. And I'm hoping gone are the days where people just memorize it and regurgitate, because that does really nothing. The purpose of education is the ability to think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Preach. You could get on that soapbox all day.
Yeah, think and resolve complex issues and training your brain to create those systems, to have those in place, that it doesn't matter if it's first grade math or you're in college or a PhD program for my two friends here, trying to resolve some really complex idea. It starts early by developing those connections in the brain and learning how to work through a problem. And I think that is a potential for how the school system, for how parents with kids at home, how we can support each other in just creating better environments for the ADHD brain to learn, and then brains in general to learn and grow. So to wrap this episode today, I would love to, again, just continue to be consistent with providing our listeners with something practical that they can take away from this episode. So they're not just tuning in and hearing a conversation, but they're left with agency and things that they can go and do about it. So for each of you, what's one thing that someone with ADHD or someone supporting someone with ADHD can start doing today to become more aware of their brain?
I'll start. Just foster that creativity, right? Making sure that you're creating an environment, not only at home within parents, but also within the school system to make sure that they're able to utilize every aspect, left side of their brain, right side of their brain, to be as creative as possible. And gone are the days of it being a stigma. I think it's something that we should channel as a positive and say there's additional resources out there, and there's really great ways to be successful, not only in school, but throughout their careers.
Yeah, I love that. Those are great, Dan. I think as we've discussed a little bit, in changing the way that you think about your brain from something negative, from this something's wrong with me, I'm struggling, and to start thinking about instead saying, when is my brain working best, or when is my kid's brain working best? And this is about pattern recognition, right? What time of day do you feel the most focused? Do you feel like you have the energy? Add in movements and how movements impact how you feel. Create little pieces of novelty, whether that's a 15-minute break to do something different, to get up, to, do whatever you need to do to get away from that space. Also the environment around you. If you find that there's one kind of environment that you feel able to focus in, that can be the stimulation around you. I mentioned in segment 1 about the novelty factor of fidgeting and movement and creating dopamine spikes. Similarly, sound can do that as well. I have a friend who, a lot of people with ADHD will have background noise or have like a TV show playing in the background, which for me would drive me absolutely crazy. Like, I work in absolute silence, which some people think I'm a psychopath for. But if you have ADHD, that background noise can do the same thing as movement. It creates tiny bits of dopamine and novelty, which really improve that. And then the last one, I'm always going to plug this because it is so crucial to brain health: sleep. Pay attention to sleep quality. If you have a bad night's sleep, what is your sleep environment? What are the things that you can do to support better sleep? Because an ADHD brain, just like any brain, is extremely state dependent. And once you start building those patterns, you can start to design your day around them to be the most successful version of yourself.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in at the end that, going off of that idea of designing your day, it's really starting to notice how your brain feels, how your focus and your productivity and your mental clarity feel, and then start to just tinker. It's a lot of fun to just kind of tinker with your routine and the structure of your day and how you go about doing things, because you'll notice that one thing works really well, or one thing doesn't work so well, or eating this food makes me feel really foggy, and eating this one at this time makes me feel really good. So just starting to pay attention to your brain and starting to get to know it through those processes.
Yeah, and I have one final kind of like nugget that I wanted to share, and it didn't really fit into any of our segments today, but I did want to mention it for folks that are thinking about trying to put this into a different context for themselves. The same systems, the same dopamine systems that are involved in ADHD are also involved in curiosity and exploration, right? So maybe evolutionarily, the traits that become ADHD like, they could have been really valuable for groups that needed people who chased novelty, explored new environments, right? The explorers who are going out on uncharted lands, or to solve unexpected problems. So when we frame how we talk about ADHD, my encouragement is to think of the ADHD brain less like it's something broken that needs fixing, and more like it's actually a high performance engine that needs the right fuel and driving conditions, right? It's the Ferrari, it's not the Honda. So when you start thinking about this, then it becomes exciting and more interesting to think about how to support that system.
Absolutely. And it's funny you bring up the Ferrari example, because when I was pitching, I ended up having shoulder surgery because I was told by the surgeon that I had a Ferrari gas pedal with how I could speed up my arm with Volkswagen brakes, not able to slow it down. And so that caused some problems. And that in a lot of ways kind of associates with the experience of the ADHD brain. You can speed up, you can get hyper focused, you can be really in tune with the things you're interested in, and then have a hard time regulating and slowing down and coming back to an emotional center. So that's a great point, and I'm glad you included that.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry about your Volkswagen brakes.
Ferraris for everybody.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you on the next episode.
You've been listening to Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network.